We made this episode before the 2024 elections. We had no idea that Trump and the GOP would have such success at a national level, gaining votes in nearly every part of the country. Even deeply blue places like New York City and New Jersey voted more for Trump in 2024 than 2020. And now it looks like the GOP will control all three branches of government and be able to move swiftly to impose their agenda on things like reproductive rights, gender-affirming care, or teaching certain sorts of histories and theories in schools and universities. What does that mean? It means that what's been happening in Texas is a harbinger of what might well happen at a federal level. So strap yourselves in and get ready for a wild ride through the anti-gender movement in Texas. But as grim as the landscape is for reproductive rights and migrant rights and gender-affirming care in Texas, remember that even in the most right-wing of cultures and political regimes, there are cracks and fissures in the system, and it is there that resistance lives. If you listen to the end of this episode, you'll hear about some brave feminist activists in Amarillo, Texas, who have been trying to fight off a billionaire-funded proposition known as Prop A. Prop A would have made their town a sanctuary for the unborn. This would have meant that abortion was completely outlawed from the moment of conception, and that anyone who used local streets and highways to get an abortion could be charged with aiding and abetting an abortion. Despite Texas voting overwhelmingly for the Republican Party and Donald Trump, this small group of organizers in the ultra-conservative Panhandle managed to educate their community and defeat the proposal by more than 20 points. So, we present to you a possible future for all of the United States. Texas, a place where there is already a near-total ban on abortion, no gender-affirming care can be provided to anyone under 18, and diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and initiatives were outlawed. This could very well be what all of the United States looks like in 5 years. But we also present to you Texas, a place where the struggle continues, and activists are not giving up, but are more determined than ever to create a more feminist future.
The stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas.
Yes, deep in the heart of Texas. That's where Lori Essig and Tina Escaja went in the fall of 2023. They wanted to find out how the anti-gender movement is taking hold in Texas and also how people are resisting it. Hi everyone, I'm Alison Seeger and welcome to this episode of Feminism, Fascism and the Future. Texas is a huge state, the second biggest in the US, right behind California, with a population of nearly 30 million. And although racially and ethnically diverse, with about 40% of the population white, 40% Hispanic, and most of the rest Black and Asian American, Texas is not really that diverse in terms of politics. The Republicans control every statewide office and have majorities in the State House and Senate. There is an entirely Republican state Supreme Court, and the Republicans control both Senate seats in the U.S. Congress. The governor of Texas since 2015, Republican Greg Abbott, is one of this country's most accomplished anti-gender warriors. Abbott hates trans kids. Here's Chris Hayes on MSNBC explaining how much.
In Texas, Governor Greg Abbott has found it helps him politically to be cruel to transgender children, to deny their very existence, and so the recent order he sent state officials is already hurting these children, their families, and care providers. This order takes what used to be normal care for trans kids and classifies that care as child abuse in the eyes of the state. And Abbott has instructed licensed professionals like doctors or teachers to report claims of trans children receiving transition care. Again, a health care decision being made within a family by the parents of the kid and the state coming in and reporting it and ratting it out. Adding that existing laws contain criminal penalties for not doing so. And this, in turn, is forcing state employees who work in family protective services to investigate these families for child abuse.
Abbott hates trans athletes, saying they are a threat to girls and women, and signed a bill into law making sure trans girls and women could not participate in women's sports.
Outside Texas Women's University, frustration was on full display. Inside its library,
The Save Women's Sports Act is now law in the state of Texas.
the mood was a celebration.
We're here because women's sports are threatened across the entire country.
Governor Greg Abbott did a ceremonial signing of SB 15, a bill that restricts what teams transgender college athletes can be on.
That Texas will stop at nothing to continue to protect women's sports for women.
Abbott hates drag, especially teachers in drag.
Governor Greg Abbott called for an end to gender non-conforming behavior by teachers. That's according to audio released by Texas Observer reporter Stephen Monticelli. It was during Abbott's keynote speech at the Young Conservatives of Texas convention in Dallas, specifically referencing a Louisville ISD teacher who went viral online after wearing a pink dress as a Spirit Day costume.
This person, a man dressing as a woman in a public high school in the state of Texas. He's trying to normalize the concept that this type of behavior is okay. This type of behavior is not okay. And this is the type of behavior that we want to make sure we end in the state of Texas.
Abbott did not define that behavior, and KXAN asked the governor's office for clarification, but has not received a response at this time.
And of course, Abbott hates abortion. Since September 2021, the law in Texas outlaws abortion from the moment a fetal heartbeat is detected, which is usually about 6 weeks. The Texas anti-abortion law is one of the strictest in the country. 20 women sued Texas over their abortion law, saying the law had caused them significant harm for not allowing medically necessary abortions. But the Texas Supreme Court ruled against the women in May of this year. So yeah, you can't get an abortion in Texas. And if you help someone else get an abortion, you could end up facing criminal penalties yourself. And although Abbott has not yet tried to ban gender studies, there are members of his party, like Representative Brian Harrison, who are trying to do so. And in June of 2023, Abbott signed a bill into law that prohibits offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Texas.
Today, 30 new laws took effect in Texas, and one of the most controversial will ban diversity, equity, and inclusion offices at public universities. Some university officials say it will, and already has, impact hiring. KENS 5's Sarah Duran joins us with more on how it might affect college campuses.
According to the Texas Tribune, the University of Houston and Texas A&M have struggled to hire faculty since this law passed last May. They blame Senate Bill 17, which officially takes effect today. This law bans diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, work at public universities. Moving forward, college campuses won't be able to offer training on diversity and inclusion for its faculty and staff. It also no longer requires diversity statements in the hiring process. Before its passage, Governor Greg Abbott said DEI policies violate federal and state employment laws, and hiring cannot be based on factors, quote, other than merit.
Hi, everyone. It's Lori Essig, and for all these reasons, I expected things to be bad when Tina and I traveled to Texas. And they were. In fact, 2 of the people we interviewed asked us after we spoke with them to make their interviews anonymous, using actors to say their words, so they wouldn't be recognizable and vulnerable to sanctions at work or in their communities. But things were not just bad. We also found a lot of resistance and hope.
Let's talk about what's going on at public universities. You talk to a professor in a gender studies department, one who doesn't wish to be identified, in part because she has seen people lose their jobs once the right wing starts attacking them.
Yeah, here's an anonymous professor of gender studies as voiced over by our colleague, Catherine Wright.
I have to be really careful about some things I say because I'm obviously still working here, though looking for jobs outside of Texas. Just this semester, Senate Bill 17 went into action, and that was to dismantle all DEI offices at public universities and anything that fell under that umbrella. Things felt kind of oppressive before that, but that was really shocking as it went into action. This year, for instance, when I created my syllabi for the fall, they were like, you have to take the LGBTQ ally statement off the syllabi. I was told, look, if you want to keep it on your syllabus, you can. However, if you get in trouble with the state, the university is not going to have your back. I think a lot of professors in my position are very wary about taking a stand. And that just went contrary to everything I believed in as a women and gender studies professor. There's things like they had just a year ago, like the Black Studies Center on campus. It still exists, but they can no longer call it that. So it's just sort of like a building without a name on it now. Some universities, I understand, just went in and fired everybody. And then other universities went in and, asked questions about like, how can we do the same thing but call it something different? How can we move things around so that it's no longer under the diversity umbrella, but it still exists? We were assured that this Senate bill wouldn't impact what gets taught in the classroom. But, I keep watching what's going on in Florida, and as long as these old white guys keep trying to out-conservative each other, I just feel like we never know what's next. They're going to have to keep pushing it in that conservative direction. It's very strategic. It's very organized. And it feels like people have been planning this for decades now. I have coworkers who keep saying that it's going to swing back the other way, but I'm just afraid of how far it's going to go to the right before it finally swings back.
One day, while teaching their Intro to Gender Studies class, the professor was attacked by a mother of one of their students. The mother was really upset by what she saw as the demonic force of gender ideology.
It's definitely changed the way that I have to teach my class. I had a mother who stormed in my classroom. To give you some context for this, I have the students fill out a first day sheet where they give me some information about themselves. And this student had written on her first day sheet that she didn't believe people were equal. And I didn't want to ask her about that in the classroom. So I engaged her in an email conversation, which was going really well for a while. And then one morning I decided to encourage her to be open-minded as she went through the semester. And so that morning, her mother stormed into the tail end of my class. Her mother said, "This gender thing is a conspiracy." Then it just went completely off the rails, and she was saying things like, Black people oppress themselves, and Black people learn that they're oppressed from their mothers, and all Mexicans are murderers and rapists. And she called the student who was standing next to me a whore and a slut. She threatened me and told me that I was going to get what was coming to me and that I better watch my back. That happened about a year ago, and that was when I started thinking that this might not be the place for me. I felt very unsafe. They did have campus police follow me for a couple weeks, and they had campus police outside the classroom. And the dean of students brought the mother and the daughter in, and they did ask me if I wanted her sanctioned in some way. And I said no. I felt like what she needed was mental health care, not a sanction. I know that could possibly happen anywhere in the United States, but it felt like it was certainly legitimized here in Texas.
As with most anti-gender movements, this one is deeply rooted in religion.
Since I've been here, I've had a number of students who tell me women can't do men's jobs, or I would never vote for a woman running for office, or particularly when they had to write a paper about gender, they would use quotes from the Bible to justify their position. So we've had to have this whole discussion about the Bible not being a peer-reviewed source. My intro class has very much become focused on how do we disagree about things, but still have a decent conversation and still respect each other, which at another university would probably not be my focus. They still are going to be completely sure that I'm making it up. It's opinion. It's not grounded in fact, because facts don't really matter right at this moment.
Our professor was quick to point out that all of this is happening at public universities. With private universities in Texas, more or less untouched by the anti-gender politics of the state.
And you know, what's very interesting to me also is this impacting public universities. I just applied to a job at a private university in Fort Worth. And of course, they required a DEI statement. None of it will touch private schools.
You also talked to our friend Stephen Chow, who worked in the Office for LGBTQIA Education and Engagement at Texas Tech in Lubbock. This office no longer exists since this would have been considered part of DEI work, which is now banned in public universities.
Yeah, that's right. Here's our conversation with Stephen.
I worked at Texas Tech University in its Office of LGBTQIA Education and Engagement. I was there from September 2019 until July 2022. I really loved my work at the Office of LGBTQIA Education and Engagement. I really did enjoy it because the programming that we were able to do that really centered queer and trans folks, not only at Texas Tech, but kind of in West Texas. And some of the programming that became our signature programs included a Pride Week in October, which always ended with one of my favorite events of the year, our Glamour and Fame drag pageant, which was always a fundraiser, during which we invited both students as well as professional drag artists in Lubbock and kind of the West Texas area to come and compete. We did receive pushback. For instance, our local state representative did not care for our office and would receive complaints from community members who did not believe in our office's mission. One time I kind of directly received a hate email. I can't even remember what the language was anymore, but some evocation of the Bible and us being sinners and things like that. I kind of celebrated that moment because I'm like, oh, we're doing something right. My personal first instance of hate mail for being in this office. Like, what an accomplishment. I did leave the office to go back to graduate school in the summer of 2022. And I guess it was about a full year later, in June of 2023, that the Texas governor, Governor Abbott, signed the Senate Bill 17 that banned DEI offices, programs, and trainings at public universities. I was not present in the state or in that role, but I remember after that bill was passed in 2023, just I think within like a month of the bill being passed, I remember out of curiosity going back to the Texas Tech website and looking for the office's website, and it was already gone. The entire DDEI, Division of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, which our office was under, was already gone. In 2022, our office did host a series of Know Your Rights workshops for the community, which included reaching out to one of the doctors in our community who provides transgender, or provided at the time, I'm not so sure anymore, gender affirming healthcare. And we also invited a lawyer that we knew who was an alumnus of Texas Tech and who did a lot of pro bono work to support LGBT folks, especially folks who need assistance changing their legal gender markers and names on IDs. And I do remember, I think that was at the time when there was a lot of fear around the bans that were starting to come up around access to transgender healthcare for children. And I remember holding that event and families from the community coming to the event and being very fearful. We don't know what attacks may come around, like documentation about ID changes. We don't know what might come down the pipe. And so creating those contingency plans, including plans to potentially leave the state soon, if it came to that.
Families with trans children are in fact leaving Texas, and even some doctors too. Here's Dr. Jimena Lopez on her decision to leave the state.
My passion is to provide gender-affirming care to transgender youth, and that has been one of the most important things I've done in my life. And it's become impossible to do that safely So I don't feel safe, especially with so many people with guns and people that have gone to protest against me or our clinic. Some of them have been armed. And I don't know, I'm afraid of leaving my son home alone. And I don't want to live like that.
At some point while talking to Stephen, our colleague Kyrie Davis, who was also on the call, jumped in because he wanted to put some of this Texas legislation into a longer historical perspective.
This is Kyrie Davis, Assistant Professor of Black Studies at Middlebury College and affiliate faculty in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. I'm also originally from Texas. I know that there's a long history of basically every legislative session in Texas that pretty much every single time since the Gender and Sexuality Center at UT Austin and the LGBTQ and Women's Center at Texas A&M went up, there was this attempt at either defunding those offices at least once per legislation session, which I assume would have affected Texas Tech, right, public institutions, or saying that if these offices are going to exist at public institutions, that there must also be like a center for traditional family values, right? And this is going back into the early 20-teens and the mid 20-teens as early as there too. So I think that could be pertinent for thinking about where this was coming down in the long run. And for context, I worked at the Gender and Sexuality Center at UT Austin during my time there in undergrad. None of them exist anymore.
As soon as the law did go into effect, even UT Austin, probably the most progressive public university in the state, had to fire people connected to DEI work.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at public Texas colleges and universities. As a result, DEI organizations and clubs are being shut down. In an email sent Tuesday from University of Texas at Austin President Jay Hartzell, he says the university has laid off employees who used to work in DEI programs. The American Association of University Professors say about 60 people were affected by these layoffs and were ordered to shut down all DEI programs by the end of May. State Senator Brandon Creighton co-authored Senate Bill 17. He sent a letter to Texas university leaders last week warning they could lose millions of dollars in state funding if they didn't comply with the law. We spoke with DEI critic Sherry Sylvester. She says these initiatives are discriminatory to non-minority groups and promote critical race theory.
People think that this is a minority recruitment program. It's not. Our universities and our state agencies should look like Texas.
Some UT students said it's a step in the wrong direction.
But as depressing as this is, Stephen did see some forms of resistance to the anti-gender movement.
People were trying to resist and continue doing the work of supporting their students and supporting marginalized students, especially queer and trans students, even as they could no longer call it DEI work. With the dissolution of our office, I think a lot of the work and the onus kind of returned to the students in student organizations like the Tech GSA to find ways to support themselves. Even as they did before the office existed, the faculty and staff are finding ways to support themselves as they did before the office existed. Folks who live in Lubbock continue to live their lives and produce art and find community and build community.
It's interesting to think about LGBTQ rights being deinstitutionalized in Texas, but also the way that student and community groups are filling in the gaps. In a way, it reminds me of how feminists in Mexico were often very clear that they did not rely on the institutions, the state, or the police to protect them. They relied on each other.
There is something about the DIY attitude of activists that's always inspiring. While we were in Lubbock, we went to see a place where people are not waiting for institutions or politicians to make things better. The East Lubbock Art House is a grassroots, nonprofit, community-based arts organization that sees its work as using art and activism to make a better community. Although just a short drive from the fight that is happening at Texas Tech, this space felt so hopeful, like another world really is possible. Outside of it were refrigerators where community members could get some food. And inside there was a riot of art, political slogans, books by BIPOC writers, and some really cool gifts. Tina and I got a chance to speak with the founder of the East Lubbock Art House, Danielle Demetrius East.
I also like to say I'm a community organizer, activist, and I just like to do a lot of stuff. So I care about people in the community, more so like not focusing on like putting a Band-Aid on issues that we have, but working towards how can we prevent issues of oppression, issues of violence. I care about East Lubbock Art House, but I also care about like the people more than so like the institution and the organization. We do a lot of arts and community-based programming. So a little bit of that is like we have free art classes that's offered to all people. We have a free library at Community Fridge. We do a lot of like community-based events. And then we also have a lot of educational programming, like we do an internship. I like to do a lot of things that really focus on community, focus on wellness, healing, and also narrative change. I live in Lubbock, Texas, so it's about 300,000 people. I really like Lubbock. It's really cool, but I feel like all places are like, they have their ups and downs. Politically, it's more so right-wing conservative, but I feel like there's a large majority of people who are more progressive, but I feel like they have a lot of fears, a lot of doubts, and there's a lot of like misinformation. So a lot of those same people might not go out and vote, or people might not be aware of them. I think it's kind of wild that the average income also in Lubbock is like $27,000. So that's kind of the average income that someone would make in Lubbock, which is right at like poverty levels. But there is kind of a big disconnect around. There's a good amount of people who.
I'm just wondering, I was struck, Danielle, about how not depressed you were about the current political moment, because I spoke to several people who felt like things have just gotten so much worse, right? Whether it's the impossibility of accessing safe and legal abortion, or the anti-trans laws, or the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion offices.
Sometimes I feel like things have kind of stayed the same. It's just kind of like it's come to the forefront more. Like I feel like a lot of issues of oppression have always existed. And that's why laws were created and enforced. So I feel like now so much it's like a lot of media. So I mean, I guess, there wasn't as much media coverage in like the 50s and 60s as we have now, where someone can just like, pull out a phone and, we can videotape or take pictures of something. So I feel like some of the same stuff is happening, might be a little different, but it's like nobody might have like seen it until someone like brought it up later or told someone else. So it was like word of mouth. This might move slower than like you posted something on TikTok and like 1,000 people see it in the next minute.
So I wonder if you could tell our listeners, just give them some advice on how to create intersectional feminist resistance to what is a global fascist movement that is both against women, feminists, Black people, migrants, immigrants, LGBTQ persons, and against a future that would be more socially just. How do we keep ourselves going? What can we do?
But I also feel like a lot of people, like, that's the thing, like, they're like, I'm going to leave this and it's going to be better. But I think that's what, a lot of right-wing conservative individuals want. They want you to leave. So it's like, that's, resistance is you staying us and to like have all this money to donate to all these causes. But a lot of it is just like being present and staying here. Like you don't have to go to every meeting, or you don't have to go to every cause and support every cause, but it's also just being present. And a lot of times that's the hardest thing too, like even just like different spaces where you don't feel comfortable, you feel like you're the only one that is like you in a room. It feels really hard and it feels really lonely, but you just have to, stand strong. You got to stand up and just also acknowledge that sometimes when you're fighting these big fights, it's not just for you, it's for other people, it's for the people around you, it's for the people that are not in the room, and for the people that are coming up after you.
Speaking of working for the generations who come after you, you and Tina got to talk to your friend Lindsay London, who's from Amarillo, Texas. She is working hard to try and make abortion accessible in Texas for all the people who will need it.
She sure is, and that's partly because Lindsay is a nurse and cares about access to medical care. But it's also because when Lindsay was living in Vermont, she had what she describes as a supportive abortion experience. This is not the case for anyone seeking an abortion in Texas. For her, coming back to Texas in the Trump years was a real shock.
My name is Lindsay London, and I'm a registered nurse based out of Amarillo, Texas, and a co-founder of the Amarillo Reproductive Freedom Alliance, or ARFA for short.
I wonder if you could describe that personal history and also maybe the political legislative history of what was going on in Texas as you came back and how you got involved in this work.
Sure. So I moved back to Texas in, May of 2019. And so, during an election year, blissfully unaware of what life was like in Texas. This is where I grew up all of my life, but then, lived in Vermont for almost 4 years and got to feel the complete 180 of what it feels like to live in a region that is progressive, community-minded, not without its flaws, of course, but just such a stark contrast. So coming back to Texas, of course, the pandemic hit that following spring and Biden came into the House, and I think we had some hope that there might be a turnaround, but the impact of Trump's 4 years in the panhandle of Texas was really significant. This has been a place that has always been deeply red and conservative. And as we saw across the nation, Trump's extremist rhetoric, his utter lack of decorum or respect in politics, we just really saw that bleed over into our community. And so the initiative for what is called the Sanctuary Cities for the Unborn first came to Amarillo in 2021. In Amarillo, we have not had abortion services here for as long as I've been alive. I'm 42 years old. So we always had to drive friends in need to Lubbock was the closest, 2 hours south, or we would head west to Albuquerque. But of course, after the fall of Roe, the trigger bans went in effect and all services completely were taken in Texas, aside from medical exemptions, which we know are a total sham and have left women on the brink of death when they're needing those services with no clear guidance for providers of what they actually can and cannot do.
I wonder if you could just stop and explain for our listeners what the Fetal Heartbeat Act was and also what this fetal sanctuary ordinances would say. What would they do?
Right. So the Heartbeat Act that was in place until Roe fell was basically until a detectable heartbeat, which we also know is also just electrical activity in a very early formed fetus. Generally, about anything after 6 weeks was outlawed, which, most pregnant people don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. So it really didn't allow abortion services for anyone. So the Sanctuary City for the Unborn initiative is spearheaded by 2 men. The legal architect is Jonathan Mitchell, and then he also helped draft the bounty hunter component of SB 8, which is now the law of the land in Texas, which gives a private right of action. There's no criminal liability for obtaining abortion, but neighbor upon neighbor can bring a civil suit against anyone that they think may have aided and abetted an abortion. So that can be funding, that can be transportation, that can be housing. It's even questionable as if that could be providing information. And so far, that's still protected under the First Amendment, but I'm sure they'd like to see that go away as well.
Wait, you mean people in Texas can just bring lawsuits against other people just for helping someone get an abortion?
Yeah, I mean, so far there's not been a flurry of people suing their neighbors, but there was this one guy, well, there's always one guy, who sued his ex-wife's 3 girlfriends for helping her get a medical abortion.
Texas women are being sued by a friend's ex-husband. He's alleging that they helped her obtain abortion pills to terminate her pregnancy. The couple divorced last year, 2 months before that abortion supposedly took place.
Wow. Suing each of the friends for $1 million?
But even this isn't enough for the anti-abortion activists. They now want to make whole cities sanctuary cities for the unborn.
So sanctuary cities is, like I said, Jonathan Mitchell doing the legal drafting of these ordinances, and then a man named Mark Lee Dixon, who is kind of the boots on the ground. And the difference in these is that they begin at conception. And what they seek to do is outlaw travel outside of the state of Texas to obtain an abortion. So while folks can't get anything in the state of Texas, these ordinances seek to then allow that same civil liability or private right of action if I was to drive a friend to Colorado, where abortion is still safe and legally accessible. We come back to Amarillo, then, an abusive partner, a family member, whomever, could then bring that civil right of action against me for assisting them out of state. So that's why they're being considered travel ban ordinances.
And given all these limitations to the sort of abortion support that can happen in Texas, what is it that your organization can do?
So we're a totally grassroots organization. We formed in July of last year, whenever Mark Lee Dixon came back into our community to present this ordinance to our city council. So we've built everything from the ground up, and we've really had to learn a lot as we go. Our primary work right now has been, first of all, informing our community about what's happening and trying to just help connect the dots between people who have a pro-choice mindset, or some of the more conservative language that we use is, in support of freedom and privacy. So we have done a lot of work to meet directly with our mayor and our city council. We attend every city council meeting. We provide public comment whenever the opportunity is available. And we've tried to just have a really professional decorum with them. We have, built an alliance now of over 500 members that are either individuals, different community leaders, that their organizations have similar pillars, sympathetic clergy, business owners, all folks who don't want this ordinance to become a part of our community. And ultimately, our goal is to destigmatize conversations around abortion and then look at shared goals. We're not going to change the majority of folks who hold anti-abortion sentiment. We are not going to change their mind. But what we have found through our conversations is that the majority of Amarillo citizens do believe in the right to safe abortion access, and they do believe in the right to medical privacy. And so we're just really working hard to have community forums. We table at every event that we can. We take every media opportunity we can just to let folks know that we're here and not let the extremist rhetoric overshadow that.
So if you drive a person to New Mexico for an abortion who is from one of these places that are deemed a sanctuary for the unborn, and that person has an abortion, you are criminally liable?
Well, that's the idea. It's not clear if it will work, but that's what Mitchell and others are trying to do.
Where comments were offered about declaring Lubbock County off limits for anyone going to New Mexico for an abortion. Like many of the speakers, Mary Hernandez supported the proposal.
Local laws reflect who we are as a society and what we stand for. Unborn babies deserve the protection that government can and should offer.
Hello, my name is Jim Baxa, here to urge you to support this ordinance to stop the trafficking of babies for murder. We can and do have laws against the sex trafficking of women. So when we're talking about abortion trafficking, We're talking about the same type of law.
Activist Mark Lee Dixon founded the Sanctuary for the Unborn movement.
We're not pulling over people on the roads. The government doesn't enforce this. No sheriff is going to be stopping people. We're not going to have canines with ultrasound equipment attached to them. That's not what this is.
Dixon said enforcement is going to depend on people filing civil lawsuits, similar to how SB 8, the Texas heartbeat law, was structured.
Women can still go to New Mexico for abortions. All we're saying in this ordinance is that anyone who would assist in that effort, we see that as aiding and abetting an abortion, and we're going to stand against it.
We've had to learn a lot more about Mitchell and his strategies, but another interesting piece about Amarillo itself is that we are the home of Judge Matthew Kaczmarek. And so he is really the pick-me judge for a lot of more extreme lawsuits that folks are trying to bring down. He was the judge that initially presided over the mifepristone case that's now at SCOTUS. He also presided over the DeAnda case, which last year stripped away teens' rights to access birth control without parental consent under Title X. So we see, and they really have their eyes heavily set on Amarillo. First of all, we're the gateway at the top of Texas to be able to access New Mexico, Colorado, Illinois for late term services. But he has not formally stated this, but what we believe he's doing is part of just a larger political chess game that hopes of possibly this ordinance getting sued, a lawsuit being brought forth against this suit, which would then land in Kaczmarek's court, which could then possibly push up to the Fifth Circuit and even SCOTUS for the larger game plan of a federal abortion ban or federal travel ban.
Yeah, and of course, it's still difficult to believe that SCOTUS would support such a thing, that the Supreme Court of the United States would support a travel ban for medical services, but I suppose anything is possible with this particular Supreme Court.
Yes, very true. I think that a lot of us at this point are very disillusioned with the court. Trump's 3 appointments are going to have lifetime negative impacts. That being said, Kavanaugh even spoke to, which was surprising, the constitutional right to interstate travel, and that should be protected for medical services, which of course includes reproductive health services. But they also all said that they would protect Roe. So there's not a lot of trust there.
Yeah, that makes sense. You said you had 500 community partners already working with you. So that does seem like this is not a popular idea. Who do you think is behind it? Who's funding this campaign? Who's supporting it?
That's kind of been the $1 million question. And there are several folks within our organization who have different incredible skill sets on research and combing through data. But it's been difficult for us to determine exactly where the funding is coming from because a lot of it is dark money. Mark Lee Dixon is a part of East Texas Right to Life. Right to Life is a huge Texas organization, but we have been able to link that there are 2 men named Dunn and Wilkes. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they are Texan billionaires who have funneled endless money into different campaigns and candidates to push forward, anti-LGBTQ legislation, anti-abortion legislation. So they have very, very deep pockets. We've seen, for example, we have some really disgusting billboards all throughout Amarillo right now. The term that they use is abortion trafficking. And so we have huge billboards that say prohibit abortion trafficking. We have another one that says stop Soros, prohibit abortion trafficking. Another that says thwart Biden, prohibit abortion trafficking. And these digital billboards are between $1,500 and $2,000 a month, and they have multiple of them running for many months on end. So, even just that in itself is tens of thousands of dollars that to me, it's like, imagine what that money could have actually done in our community for pregnancy prevention, comprehensive sex education, which in Texas as well, there is no comprehensive sex education for young people in the schools. It's abstinence only programs. So they're not equipping young people with the tools or resources to prevent a pregnancy. And then they're going to force them to have birth. So it's really heartbreaking.
We have an update from Lindsay. What's happened in the city of Amarillo is that at the end of May, their city council voted down an ordinance to make Amarillo a quote-unquote sanctuary for the unborn, which was a huge victory for the ARFA. But in the 2 steps forward, 3 steps back process, the Sanctuary City anti-gender activists managed to get a proposal on the ballot. So this election day, November 5th, citizens of Amarillo will vote on Proposition A, the so-called Sanctuary City for the Unborn ordinance. Amarillo will be the only city in Texas to have abortion on the ballot in November.
Yeah, but what I love is none of this is stopping Lindsay and her feminist comrades from fighting in Amarillo.
What's interesting about Amarillo, we're not a small town. We're a town of over 200,000 people. We're also a refugee relocation center, it's like Burlington. And so we are home to many, many diverse cultures, nationalities, beliefs, religions. And yet the evangelical Christian and Christian nationalist movement has a formidable impact on city government and just kind of the overarching narrative of what happens in our community. And we're working really hard to change that, along with LGBTQ organizations. We have Smile Big, we have Amarillo Pride, we have PASO, which is the Panhandle AIDS Support Organization. So there are wonderful pockets of diverse, progressive, amazing people. And we're working really hard to coordinate all of our networks together because we have shared goals.
That's amazing. And I love to hear about feminist and queer resistance to this movement because it can feel so overwhelming, right? They have control of so much of our court system. They do control a huge amount of funding.
I think it works because everybody is exhausted and fearful for one reason or another. And so that division, I think that divisive tactics are appealing to folks in many ways. And if you can put a boogeyman figurehead at the top of it, then it's easy to have someone to blame or to fear. And it dehumanizes the actual community members who are acting from their heart and their mind for the best interests of their community. How we have combated that is really just having person-to-person conversations. Our tabling events are some of our favorite opportunities because we get the chance to just connect, in a usual, like a casual, fun community setting. Our tabling is always beautiful and fun. And so we are just trying to remind folks that we have all walks of life in our community and that everyone's lived experience is valuable and matters. And as I mentioned before, you have to read the room, right? There's certain rooms where we can scream unapologetic abortion anytime, any place. And then there's other rooms where we have to just pivot on privacy and freedom and loving your neighbor and even using some Christian ideology in that way. Hey, this is about loving your neighbor. And that means that we support them in their difficult times. And it's not our business why they may choose whatever path they may take. I'm not a Christian myself, but that's how I was brought up. And it's the pervading religious belief of this region. So yeah, I think ultimately the way we do it is just by continuing to build community and have those one-on-one conversations. These last 9 months have probably been the most exhausting of my life, but yet also the most invigorating and satisfying. Our lead team in ARFA is a group of 6 women from different backgrounds with different skill sets, and we all have full-time jobs and families, and we are somehow finding the way to work at least another part-time, if not full-time job each week in the organizing efforts for what it's taking. And it's not glamorous. It's really hard and frustrating and discouraging at times, but it's also been so beautiful, especially seeing folks that maybe never felt comfortable being forward facing before, or have never spoken at a city council meeting before, or have never said the word abortion at the dinner table. And they're finding the courage to do that. And that's so beautiful and wonderful.
I think that's really inspiring for our listeners who are often younger people who see what's going on, and it's difficult to imagine fighting back. But I think you're showing how there are cracks and fissures in any community where you can get in, whether it's love your neighbor, or I'm wondering if there's anything you'd want our listeners to know, like what kind of things should we be saying to people in their 20s or 30s or older people too, who are really devastated by this anti-gender movement and don't know what to do? What kind of advice might you have for them?
So something that there's 2 phrases that I always go back to in my mind when I feel discouraged. One is that there are many roads in the revolution. Not everybody is going to want to be at the front of a protest march with a bullhorn. You know, it's about finding like-minded people in your community and getting together on a regular basis, and within your capacity and comfort level. That can be over Zoom, that can be through DMs, that can be actually in person. But the more you get to know your community, the more you find what each individual's unique skill sets are. And that's how you can really start to build a network together. And what's great about working with others too is that the fatigue is real, the burnout is real. And when you need to step away, you have a group of individuals who are motivated for the same goal as you are. So the momentum will keep moving forward. And that's how we tend to one another and care for one another, because none of us, you can't do it all the time. You just can't. And the other phrase I like is that, you know, all systems of oppression are interwoven, right? And so when you tug at the tiny little string in your corner of the world, in whatever way that may be, in time, we can unravel all of it. So everything, every little step counts, whether you're organizing the protest or you're providing childcare or you're nourishing your own family and being grateful, you know, it all matters. So as long as we do something, I believe that in time we can build the world that we hope for.
One of the really cool threads that ties Lindsay's work to the abortion rights movement in Latin America is this group in Amarillo is using the symbol of the green scarf.
I love that. And we also, we wear green whenever we go to city council here in honor of the Green Wave movement that was started in Latin America and Argentina. And so that's something that we do that just also helps us feel like we are a part of the wider web and the wider work.
But I don't want to end on too optimistic a note. The anti-gender movement in Texas is strong. And as Republicans consolidate their political power and attack universities and drag queens alike, the effects are real for people living there. One of the most aggressive moves by the anti-gender Republicans was outlawing any sort of gender-affirming care for anyone.
Largest state to block gender-affirming care for transgender children, the law going into effect today after months of protests against it.
Children need to be protected and allowed to develop into the gender they were born with.
The bill would prevent transgender minors from accessing hormone therapy and puberty blockers. The bill also bans transition surgeries for anyone under 18, though medical experts say those are rarely performed on children.
This law only seeks to prohibit treatments only for transgender youth with gender dysphoria, while allowing the exact same medical care, including puberty blockers and hormones, to be prescribed to any other minor for any other reason or medical diagnosis.
We had the opportunity to speak with a doctor who had previously specialized in gender-affirming care. They too wish to remain anonymous, so our colleague Victoria Luksch is reading their words. But here's the part of their story we can tell.
I started medical school in the 90s, and I did my residency in the mid to late 90s, and I've seen the changes in what I'm able to do and in the environment in which I work. Family medicine is a very flexible type of specialty. They asked if I'd be willing to learn how to do transgender hormone therapy, and I said, I'm willing to learn because I don't have any personal objections to it. And if the patients are willing to put up with my learning curve, then it's fine with me. And the patients were very willing to put up with my learning curve. So I read the literature and I started providing the treatment through word of mouth in my practice. That was 10 years ago. I have a colleague who's been doing this even longer than that, maybe 15 years, and another physician in the community who'd been doing transgender hormone therapy since at least when I was in residency in the mid-90s, if not longer than that. So this is not a social fad, as you'll hear a lot of people who oppose the therapy claim it to be. The first transgender surgeries were actually done in Europe in the 1930s, so you can't tell me that a social fad has lasted 100 years. And there are multi-year-long waiting lists for patients waiting to see surgeons. They save up for years. And you need to have somebody with you for the immediate post-op recovery because physically, any surgery in your reproductive area, it's going to hurt. And it's going to be hard to get to that 2-week post-op appointment. So it costs money just to stay in a hotel for 2 weeks or longer, and to have somebody with you who's able to pay for the food and transportation costs out of pocket, and that is all in addition to the procedure, if your insurance covers it or not. So this is a huge, huge investment. This is not an easy thing for people to do. And of course, this current generation is all online. Teenagers are all on the internet. They get all the good and the bad information that's out there. At least they have done their homework. And this tells me that they have spent a lot of time on it. And this tells me how important it is to them to get all the important information.
Despite being in line with nearly all the research on gender-affirming care, this doctor was always under attack for their work, generally by Christians who used the Bible to justify attacking medical practices.
This is not considered a pathological condition. This is considered a spectrum of gender. There's a spectrum of sexuality. It's not either or. It's not black or white. I'm like, you do not mix religion and politics. And when Jesus was first around, there was no USA. There were no Democrats. There were no Republicans. There was imperialism, but there was not the fascism that exists today, where you're trying to prevent people from even having a thought, let alone live their lives when they're not even hurting anyone. At the time I started going to church, it was more about grace, and it was about learning and actively reading the Bible, joining study groups, but there was no agenda being pushed when I first started going to the church. That started developing later, like in the mid to the late 90s, when both the anti-gender movement and the anti-abortion movement started to grow. But honestly, it hadn't become that political until Trump was elected. Then they started to try to push people to vote to a certain way, catering to a segment of the population while they ignore everybody else. They're ignoring generations of people who, the more you look at the data, the more each subsequent generation from the baby boomers on is willing to express that they are LGBTQ. It's 20% in the current most recent generation, like Gen Alpha. But millennials and Gen Z are also much more willing to express that they're LGBTQ.
And of course, this religious agenda against gender-affirming care eventually became the law of the land in Texas.
So what you've got in Texas is an attorney general, Ken Paxton, who basically tried to create a culture, an environment, where neighbors report on neighbors. So you can report on your neighbor to the Child Protective Services if you have a neighbor that has a transgender kid that's getting treated by doctors. So this happened to my colleague. One of her patients in their early teens started having nightmares. He was so worried that his doctor was going to be thrown in jail. He was so worried on her behalf. That's how much anxiety this provoked in that child, worrying about their physician. It's something to tell these kids we hate them. I also have to think that many of these child protective service workers, they have common sense, but they're probably also somewhat believing that there's this gender ideology that's destroying children. There's this one factoid running around the internet saying that your brain is not adult until you're 26. There's no basis for that in reality. It's not like a switch flips and all of a sudden you become an adult. And an 18-year-old can be drafted and learn how to use a gun and kill people. That's okay to do, but it's not okay for them to make a decision on getting hormone therapy. They can get married, they can have children, they can raise those children for good or ill, but they can't have an abortion. And they can't get hormone therapy. Unless you're over 18 years of age, you cannot get hormone therapy in Texas. And they have listed specific drugs that I cannot prescribe, which include puberty blockers and testosterone. I have had patients who are 16 and 17 years old who want to start treatment, and their parents are in agreement, and they are willing to sign all the consent forms necessary. Once they are 18, you cannot prevent them from accessing care. But even though we know that the research shows that waiting will put these kids at an even greater risk for depression and suicide, especially having to go through puberty, there's nothing you can do if you're a kid in Texas except seek mental health counseling, to be able to learn coping strategies for the dysphoria, to get antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, because you're not going to get hormone therapy. And if I'm a parent and I say, okay, fine, I'm going to take my kid to see a doctor elsewhere, what happens then? I can be reported for child abuse. It's not like the doctor's going to report people and no pharmacist is going to report them, but they may end up leaving the state of Texas and moving to a state that has not created those barriers for their kids' care, like Colorado or New Mexico. I know parents who are like, I think I'm going to have to find a job and move in order to make sure my kid gets the care they need.
This doctor was afraid, but they weren't necessarily convinced that trans kids can't survive in Texas.
And it's interesting. Even though Texas is supposedly a big conservative state, there are lots of pockets of people who care about individuals. And when I ask my patients who are currently working, who are young, how they're being treated in the workplace, they say great. They say the people they work with are making sure to watch out for them and making sure that they're protected. So even people who might vote for a politician who's passing these laws, on a personal level, they too want to protect the people that they're working with. It's a weird dichotomy. Like some of it is how you were raised and if you were raised to vote this particular way. In Texas, we're not working on helping improve families and institutions that would help promote community, that would help reduce the need for people to think about getting into drugs and alcohol in the first place. No, instead, it seems like we have at least one political party that is happy to consolidate power through calling others out. Not just trans people, of course, but they are going for the transgender people first. And it's only a matter of time before everything starts eroding. So it'll go from the transgender and LGBTQ to the people of color and to women, so that the rights that have been gained since women got the right to vote in the 1920s are slowly being eroded again.
Our doctor really believed that it was generational. The old white politicians, mostly men, saying a big F you to a much more sexually and gender diverse younger generation.
And I think it's more generational than anything else. As you look at the religious influences, right? How many people in every generation are going to church? It's less and less every subsequent generation. Our kids see diversity in school. They're all part of the same classes coming through. And I think that is my hope for the future. I am hopeful that there's this new generation and that eventually this entire anti-trans movement will die out. I can help my patients learn how to live with their feelings. I can treat their depression and anxiety. They haven't prevented me from doing that yet. It's frustrating, yeah. It's scary. I'm not going to lie. It's something to not be able to take care of your patients. How are we as doctors coping, not being able to take care of our patients? We chose to do this. We chose to be there for our patients regardless of whether they're LGBTQ or not. It'd be like telling me that I can't treat the alcoholic anymore. Like I can't treat the drug addict or the obese person. Like I can't treat the smoker or the person with dementia.
Not only are individual doctors afraid, but so are the institutions where these doctors work and learn. Right now, right-wing politicians are using Freedom of Information requests to find out what's being taught about gender-affirming healthcare.
In theory, the schools could have said no and lost that 1% of state funding. But of course, they don't want to be on the news saying that they refuse to comply with the Freedom of Information Act request. When you're going into healthcare, you're supposed to care about people and their long-term health, not politics. We signed on to do this. We signed on to be part of their lives and part of their health. And doctors are advocates for their patients, no matter what their backgrounds are. I think that's where some of my optimism comes in, because the medical profession attracts caring, compassionate people who want to make a difference in the lives of people.
That's not the worst way to end this episode on Texas, with the firm belief that the good in people will, in the end, defeat this fever dream of the anti-gender movement. A dream where abortion, trans people, and anyone who is not a US citizen can be made to disappear.
Not bad, because Texas may be in the midst of a fight over the future, and right now the anti-gender far-right politicians are winning. But witnessing the resistance in Texas really reminded me that we cannot know the future. So now I have to say my thank yous.
You do.
I want to thank my colleague Tina Escaja for traveling to Texas with me and driving for what seemed like hundreds and hundreds of miles while looking for some good vegan food. To my friend, colleague, and Texas native Kyrie Davis for making sure this episode is true to his state. And El Fahey, Harper, Julian Seeger-Reed, and you, Allison Seeger, for all the production and editing work that you all do. And of course, I do want to thank Beyonce for reminding us that this ain't Texas. It's about as far from Texas as you can get. This is feminism, fascism, and the future. And if you like this podcast, follow us, share with friends, have a listening party, and pitch us your ideas. And look out for upcoming episodes that include a new series we're calling We Talk with Really Smart People.